In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Well, I do not think that President Eisenhower has done anywhere near what he could have done. I wonder whether it's too late. I don't think it's too late. But I think the president should have, shortly after the decisions, or at least by now, have gotten on a television network or radio and spoken as the chief executive of this government to the good people of the South, urging them to support the decision of the Supreme Court as the law of the land, whether they believed in it or not, and to use the full influence of his position as president to bring about peaceful solution of this problem. I think he was obliged to do that, and I think that his failure to do so does not help us at all, especially when we realize that as a result of the failure of the good forces to take over, we have allowed these other forces like the White Citizens Councils and the Klan to threaten and intimidate good people.
In Brown versus Board of Education, the lawyers arguing for the plaintiffs for integration had to fight the existing holding of separate but equal from Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. The goal in both cases was to reach equality. The key difference was that the integrationists had to prove that segregation couldn't mean anything but inequality. Still, when framed this way, an interesting implication is revealed. The integrationists, in fighting segregation, were also establishing equality of students under education, beyond just policies of segregation. This perspective presages future conflicts and ramifications of Brown versus Board of Education. It also foreshadows the deep remaining scars of segregation and inequality left in our education system. To understand the future, however, we must first look to the foundations that led to this landmark decision. Precedent was the key to victory in the integrationist case. Specifically, Sweat versus Painter in 1950, where the Supreme Court ruled that Herman Sweat's rejection from the University of Texas Law School, despite legal segregation, violated the 14th Amendment's equal protection. This was because Sweat's lawyers had proven the two schools unequal. Significantly, the argument for inequality did not come from unequal curriculum or funding, but from the reputation of the faculty and influence of alumni. This case established that immaterial factors could establish inequality. Because the court had previously upheld separate but equal in Pless versus Ferguson, the integrationists had to approach this argument from an entirely new angle. They argued that separate facilities were inherently unequal, even if materially equal, and could never be made equal through balancing just facilities, qualifications of faculty, or funding. They did this through establishing that segregation implies inferiority, relying on a novel new kind of evidence, the social sciences.
And so the district court ruled that it was perfectly lawful to have this segregated, separate, and equal facilities. So it became down on the Browns legal team to provide evidence that segregation is inherently detrimental to and not equal for the children. And this is where a lot of the psychology that I find super interesting comes in. Kenneth and Mamie Clark had an experiment called the doll test, in which they showed two identical dolls to children, except one was black and the other doll was white. They would ask the children questions concerning the personality traits, if you will, of these two dolls. So they would say, which doll is nice, or which doll is mean, which doll is pretty, which doll is ugly, which doll is evil, that kind of stuff.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
And then at the end of the test, they would ask which doll the child most looks like. And then oftentimes, children just wouldn't answer, or they would possibly just start to cry and run away. And so this really showed to the court here, the Supreme Court, that segregation is inherently, detrimental to the psychology of the children here. There's a great quote that I'd like to read here. One second. So after the case, this is from the NAACP website here. After the Brown versus Board, to separate African American children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. So, this is incredibly salient in that point. In light of this evidence, the Supreme Court ruled that separate is not equal, and that there's no place for the segregation period in the school system. And this kind of has some implications for today as well that I would like to touch real quick about. The Clarks were really testing the implicit bias of these children, and that is something that teachers and children have to deal with in the world today all the time. So it's our media is saturated with these ideas that dark is bad and light is good. Even in Disney movies, Scar in The Lion King was a darker shade of lion. Ursula in The Little Mermaid was a darker shade of sea creature. Jafar in Aladdin was a darker shade of human. So it's being perpetuated not only in Disney movies, but all throughout. And so, not only is implicit bias strong today in society, but it's also something that really takes training, that we can't just be aware of it and have it not affect our lives. That's the whole point of it. It's that it's implicit, it's inherent, that our society has created such a system that it's unseen. It's an unseen violence that perpetrates every day.
Drawing off of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that segregation in public schools was illegal, the Little Rock, Arkansas superintendent, Virgil Blossom, decided to submit a proposal to the board for a gradual integration of the public school system. And he did this in 1955, so it's pretty close to right after the ruling of Brown versus Board of Education. And so what that proposal said was that in September of 1957, at the beginning of that school year, they would start integrating black students into Central High School. And the board overwhelmingly adopted this. This was the plan. This is what's going to happen. All this was in response to the, how do we, comply with this law, but also because the local chapters of the NAACP president, Daisy Gaston Bates, she had, obviously inflicted a little bit of that pressure. Is hey, if you need to comply to this law, we can help. And so she was directly responsible for, enrolling the Little Rock Nine, but also, it's it was ultimately Virgil Blossom's proposal that brought in this change into the school system. So September 1957, beginning of the school year, students are getting ready to come into the school, and Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, brings in the National Guard to prevent the black students from entering Central High School, claiming that it was to protect them. And I mean, the thought of bringing in National Guard to stop students from going to school today might seem a little bit extreme, but during a time of segregation, it's still a little bit extreme. I mean, it was to the point where, okay, so we've got Virgil Blossom, the superintendent, who is on board with integration. We have Woodrow Wilson Mann, who's the mayor, who's also on board with this. So what does he do? He calls President Eisenhower and is like, we need federal help. I mean, like, the kids cannot get into school. We need to get them into classes. It's been weeks and they still are being denied access to class. So Eisenhower brings in the 101st Airborne Army and basically takes over the Arkansas National Guard under federal control. So like all these 10,000 people who were against, pushing these students away are now responsible for making sure that they are able to get in. And I mean, just that flip of taking, it's like, we'll take this stance, as Orville Faubus decided to do, that you can't get in. And, having to have the President of the United States get involved in a national, policy, because the local chapter, the local politician, or I should say the state leader doesn't want, to comply with federal law. I mean, that's pretty extreme. I mean, there's a deep amount of racism and bigotry that this nation has as a whole and refuses to acknowledge, and it was really brought out in 1957 with the Little Rock Nine.
After the Brown decision, there was a considerable resistance movement throughout the South to avoid implementing the changes that were required. One example is the Declaration of Constitutional Principles. It's also called the Southern Manifesto, and it's basically 101 Southern politicians drafted this document in response to the passage or the decision of Brown v. Board. They cited the 10th Amendment and basically said, hey, the Constitution doesn't address education, so it should be left to the states. So they felt that the federal government was overstepping its bounds by involving itself and telling the states how to handle segregation or integration in public schools. The authors promised to use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of this decision, which they felt was unconstitutional. An example of a sort of legal approach to subverting the decision is the massive resistance movement in Virginia, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a massive resistance movement that tries to create laws and policies to oppose desegregation efforts. So it was kind of put into motion by Virginia's Senator Harry Boyd, and the goal was to just unite white politicians and leaders in Virginia to just build up laws and policies to subvert the decision. So one of these laws was called the Stanley Plan, and it withheld state funding from integrated schools. So if a school decided to integrate, their state funding was gone. And then it authorized the governor to shut down these schools if he wanted to. And then what it did, it took the funding that had previously gone to these schools and it set up like a tuition grant program that would redistribute this money to individual students in the form of like a grant or a scholarship so they could attend a segregated private school of their choice.
But that, in fact, was the problem. The plaintiffs argued that Topeka's open enrollment policies produced voluntarily self-segregation, as whites fled to the suburbs, leaving the east and west sides of Topeka unequal in student populations. East elementaries were 70% minority, while the west were 4. Worse, Topeka was predominantly placing black faculty in majority black schools. In 1989, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit ruled 2-1 in favor of the plaintiffs. They agreed segregation remained despite no active policies of segregation. They insisted Topeka must work to better integrate their schools. Their solution was to bus students between the two sides of Topeka. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 1977 advocated busing between cities and suburbs as the only way to desegregate the country. But busing proved problematic. Protests erupted across the country, and in places like Boston, they turned violent. Furthermore, white students simply fled the public schools, joining private and parochial schools. And when the Supreme Court decided in Milliken v. Bradley that busing between districts was unconstitutional unless both districts had policies of segregation, well, busing has decreased significantly as a solution since. However, de facto segregation wasn't solving itself. Segregation in inner-city schools was increasing, and not by policy. President Reagan encouraged the development of magnet schools, which were intended to draw white students into schools of predominantly minority groups. It was called the blueprint for school desegregation in the future. Unfortunately, magnet schools are no longer the future. They're the present, and they aren't helping. Black and Hispanic students are increasingly isolated. In the South, only 29% of their peers are white, down from 36% in 1980. Black students are more isolated today than ever before. 3/4 of blacks and 2/3 of Hispanics attend low-income schools. Other alternative options, such as charter schools, are at best perpetuating segregation, and they might be worsening it. Studies have found that charter schools tend to self-aggregate too. While only 4% of traditional public schools are 99% minority, 17% of charter schools are 99% minority. That number rises to 25% when you look at charter schools in cities. In 1979, parents were voluntarily self-segregating, just as they are now. They pushed back against efforts to integrate charter schools. Brown v. Board of Education's landmark decision was about more than just the dismantling of segregation. It established that all forms of segregation produce inequality, and that equality of education is an important right guaranteed to all students. Are our schools living up to the promise of Chief Justice Earl Warren's immortal words, that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place here? Will the arguments of Brown v. Board of Education be directed to charter schools, just as they were to open enrollment? Time will tell. But this much is clear. Segregation is more than just policy, and its scars are going to be felt on America for much longer to come.
So this idea that the Clarks kind of set forward here is, represents also a lot of psychology, popular of the time as well, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, you have a pyramid, and at the bottom are basic needs like food, water, shelter, belonging, safety, and then higher on the pyramid we have, achievement, and like learning would be one of those higher levels on the pyramid, and at the top is self-actualization. So Maslow argues that you can't get to the next level in the pyramid without achieving some base level. So if the children in the community are always feeling out of place, they don't feel safe, because of the segregation that's going on inherently, they're not going to be able to learn as well, or develop in the way that they should.
So who are the Little Rock Nine? They were 9 students that Daisy Gaston Bates, the NAACP Arkansas president, was personally responsible for making sure that they were enrolled in the school, and also, they were handpicked by the NAACP to make sure that they could handle the stress of being integrated into a white school, and knowing what they were going to encounter. They also had to make sure that these students were counseled and prepared for how to respond to hostile situations that they would encounter. And it was just all this so that they could, these are kids trying to attend school and deciding that they were going to bring about this compliance with the national policy of integrating, public schools rather than keeping them segregated. And so, I mean, like, you've got, there's 9 of them. So there's Minnie Jean Brown, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Thelma Mothershed, Melba Patillo, Gloria Ray, Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, and Carlotta Walls. And so there's 9 of these kids, and then Daisy Bates was able to get a hold of 8 of them for the day that they're going to go to school, the first day, which was, I think, the second day of school, because they didn't want, there was a little like, okay, this is what's going to happen for the kids that are there, is what the principal had wanted to do, to explain to the white students that the next day that they were going to have 9 black students enrolled in their school. And just wanted to basically prepare them for that so that there wouldn't be, an onset of violence or anything like that, which obviously didn't matter. But one of the students, Elizabeth Eckford, did not have a phone. Her family doesn't have a phone, did not have a phone. And so she did not get the message that Daisy had basically got a group of people to carpool so that they could all walk in together. And, I mean, this is most notable in that scream picture where you see this just white woman just vehemently screaming, at this one girl. And that's Elizabeth Eckford. And I mean, let's just take a second to appreciate the amount of courage these 9 kids had to have in order to even put themselves in this situation where they knew they were going to encounter so much pushback from the public and from their, classmates and from their classmates' parents. And we see the power of students banding together to make change in our political system, in our schools, in our lives, and to know that even if we're not fully realizing the ruling of Brown versus Board of Education today, that the Little Rock Nine made a huge impact on how the world saw this particular issue. I mean, this put faces on the realities of racism and bigotry in this country.
There's much more to say about the resistance that happened throughout southern states following the Brown decision. But really, these issues are best explored through song. And I have been on the phone a lot, and I actually managed to convince Bob Dylan to contribute to this video. So without further ado, I give you the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Bobby D. Hello friends, I appreciate you having me on. I want to take this opportunity to perform a song for you that I wrote in the years following the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, and of course the subsequent Brown 2 case, which told the southern states to implement a plan of integration with all deliberate speed. As we know, there was a lot of opposition, a lot of tactics of delay throughout the South, and it wasn't really until the Civil Rights Act was passed 10 years after Brown v. Board that change really started to happen. So I wrote this song kind of in those times, dealing with those struggles and strife. Well, the moon shines bright on the schoolhouse tonight, not a student to be seen. A kingdom of segregation that is so unjust and mean. But change is howling like a swirling storm inside. Couldn't keep us out. Heaven knows they tried. They said, don't let them in, don't let them see. A separate world is how it has to be. Conceal, don't feel, don't let them know. Well, now we know. Integrate with all deliberate haste. Integrate before it is too late. And I don't care if you stand in the way. Let the storm rage on, 'cause school is for everyone anyway. Thank you, friends.